This is the most important part. What would it take to have something like the EU, since I've been asked to draw that parallel? So, in the evolution of India-Pakistan trade, one big factor, because I was asked to study this problem during the Imran Khan government and gave my findings to the National Security Advisor and to other people, I said that if you have to warm up to India, you better be ready, because they are very ready to do things. They've already planned it out if you warm up to them, and we haven't done our homework. The main question comes down to trade complementarity. How much of their needs can you fulfill, and how much of your needs can they fulfill? And the ratio of trade complementarity is they can fill up a big chunk of what you would need, but you cannot fill up a big chunk of what they need. That is the first disadvantage. The second thing I pointed out is non-tariff barriers. मैं उर्दू में कहना चाहूँगा कि उस साइड पे ज़रा कमीनगी होती है, और वो कमीनगी ऐसी होती है कि वो कहेंगे अरे भैया ज़रूर आओ, और फिर जब आपकी चीज़ें होती हैं वो लेते नहीं हैं, कहते अरे भाई इन्होंने तो लेना ही नहीं था, अपन क्या करें? That is the non-tariff barrier. They dissuade their people in strategic and silent ways not to purchase your things, but they say khula hai. That's very different. The other thing is dumping and trade practices. So they could literally, if the trucks are allowed, they would literally flood your markets, crush your producers in things as rudimentary as tomatoes and onions further up the chain. Part of the reason is because our industries, many of them have been very comfortable, protected, sitting around getting state subsidies or other forms of support, and they haven't had to compete in international markets. So if they were brought into the arena, imagine एक पहलवान बैठा हुआ है और उसने कभी लड़ाई नहीं की, आराम से मालिश कराता रहता है, and then suddenly उसको मैदान में डाल दिया जाता है, और it would be a little rough. And this, आपको इसका अंदाजा इन चीजों से होगा कि आप देखें आपकी सुजुकी मेहरान. I was very very young in the late 80s, and वही जो मेहरान उस वक्त चल रही थी वो आज भी सड़कों पे है, उसी हालत में है. Whereas if you look at cars in Europe or in the United States, अगर आप लोगों ने Transformers movies देखी हैं, तो Optimus Prime type की चीज फिर रही है अब उनकी सड़कों पे, इतनी advanced चीज है. So the other thing, this also ties into the non-tariff barriers, और वो जो कमीनगी की मैं गुजारिश कर रहा था, कि there is a deep-seated hostility and mean-spiritedness. और इसका आप अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं अभी जो सिखों के साथ उन्होंने किया है, या अभी क्रिकेट में जो वो बदमाशियां कर रहे हैं. It's quite disgusting. So basically उनका DNA बदल चुका है, और उसकी एक खास वजह ये है कि ये जो नरेंद्र मोदी साहब हैं, मोदी जी, he is the first prime minister to be born after 1947. इससे पहले जो इनके प्रधानमंत्री थे, उनकी एक पाकिस्तान से कोई ना कोई लगाव था, कोई होश थी कि ये लोग हम जैसे ही हैं. 47 के बाद जो पैदा हुए हैं वो अपने ही कूजे में बैठ के ना नफरत फैलाते रहे, और ये वो. So it's quite a DNA उनका बदल चुका है. Okay, now the boring statistics. What I want you to see from these two graphs is कि जब हमारे उनके साथ ताल्लुकात इतने कशीदा नहीं थे, so their exports were far larger, and ours were smaller and quite stagnant. That's the first thing. And the other thing is the sorts of things we exported to one another were not fancy things on both sides. उन्होंने भी कोई semiconductor नहीं भेजे थे. It was like tanning and dyes and vegetables, plastics, cotton, जो कि हमें खुद भी उगाना चाहिए, और वो भी कहेंगे कि हमें खुद उगाना चाहिए. So there isn't a complexity in it, but there is a complementarity issue. कि वो आपको प्याज सस्ता बेच देंगे, that kind of thing. They can address up to 60% of the things you need. This is an assessment from the Pakistan Business Council, but you can address only 20% of what they need. So keep that in mind. तो आप तैयारी कर लें पहले, homework सही तरह करके फिर मैदान में आए, थोड़े डर निकाल के फिर मैदान में कुश्ती करें. Because trade is not just a प्यार मोहब्बत की प्रेम की कहानी नहीं होती. It's a competition. The global trade system is a competitive area. It is combat in a sense too, right? And this idea goes back to 400 years plus of mercantilism. कि इनकी मंडियां तबाह कर दो, हम अपनी चीज भेजेंगे. That is how South Asia was destroyed by the Europeans to begin with. They cut the thumbs of the Bengal weaver for a reason, right? That this is the trade is a vulgar area. If any of you have done any economics as part of your studies, then you hear this thing about the gains of trade and consumer surplus, and it is true कि यहाँ पे अफरात ज़र कम हो जाएगा, खास तौर पे जो आपकी बुनियादी अशिया हैं उनमें, which is to say कि सब्जियाँ वगैरह सस्ती हो जाएंगी, consumer surplus है, but producer surplus is really decimated. So you have to look, and that has impacts for employment, for savings, and so forth. And on the other side, because SAFTA is not just about India, there's the transit route issue with Afghanistan, and as you know, our government has taken a very tough stance on the migrants, और इनको कहा है कि 1 नवंबर तक आपके पास वक्त है, उसके बाद फिर आपका वो स्वागत यहाँ पे उस तरह से नहीं होगा, right? So it's a different attitude, and many people endorse this. Is broad support for this. You may have your own opinion, of course. So the transit trade issue is quite important, and it's not just that we are trying to get things to Afghanistan, but then beyond to Central Asia. That is the vision of connectivity, which you hear a lot for people who are big thinkers and sitting in high-powered places. So that is the ye pas manzar of the trade over that. So then when I was asked to say that, I said it, and I said it in this manner also, with the analogy of the Pahalwan and all this. Now, when you frame this question of regional integration, they say SARC. You've heard of SARC, I've heard of SARC my whole life, and they draw a map like that. And they say that, wow, it is 2 billion people. It is fast growing. Other than Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, this is where, or the Middle East, this is where the action is, the future demographic dividend. It has already 4.5 trillion GDP and a rising GDP per capita. It also has a common history, and it has common systems, which is where I would challenge Professor Irene that harmonization is actually inherited here. हम सारों ने बर्तानिया से लिया था. We all inherited the British common law system in Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka and Burma. It was more harmonized. It's the same ancestor, right? So, actually, but there's some weaknesses too in SARC, which is that the infrastructure is poor. There was this thing called the GT road from Kabul to Calcutta. That's just doesn't exist in the same sense anymore, etc. And diplomatic relations are tense, and SARC trade within it is only 5% of the trade. So every country is a little bit outward focused. So that's the argument you get. But I draw the map differently. And I say that there are two separate regions that have come across, and this is basically a reflection of how human beings draw human boundaries on the natural world. The EU is a great example of that because it's hard to really say where Europe ends and Asia begins. I mean, Europe has for the past 10,000 years basically been an appendage of Asia, right? And then they had a concept of it, and they defined the world's boundaries, and that is a human impact. Similarly, you see that here, the previous esteemed speaker mentioned BIMSTEC. That is the Bay of Bengal, but it's not Pakistan or Afghanistan. They are the dark blue, creating their own system there. Of course, it's underfunded. BIMSTEC, it lacks a free trade agreement. There are border disputes, so it's certainly not perfect, but they're working towards that. And at the same time, the vision that is articulated by Pakistan and other countries is more the CPEC stuff, the Central Asia route, all of this stuff. So basically, what was a border drawn by the British has become a hard reality of a boundary, and it's one of the most policed boundaries on earth, especially on the Indian side. So human beings do frame things differently. There is no natural boundary, so it's not like there's a river or a mountain range, but human beings define that. So I actually argue that SARC cannot make sense because the elites of both countries, India and Pakistan, have different worldviews. They're not particularly interested, and that's manifest here. So, before 1965, you could literally walk over the border. It wasn't a big deal, and people were migrating and reconciling families and all that stuff, but it's become hyper-securitized over time. And politics has a significant influence in shaping geography, not just vice versa. So, is this so strange? Are we a too crazy bunch of people, or is regionalization a broader trend in the world? It is. Globalization was a mantra that I certainly grew up in my education hearing about all the time and how free trade is wonderful. But the people who argued for that have been intellectually dismantled and demolished. Because many people suffered under globalization, whether in the sweatshops of Asia, whether in the dying rust belts of America, the people who vote for Trump, for example, many people were left behind. They are not interested in this nonsense. And so you see a regionalization of supply chains. What was sent by the US corporations to China has now gone to Mexico. Important things were being dealt with by Germany are moving to countries like Poland, etc. Regionalization is a world phenomenon. But the thing is, how do you define region? It depends on a human essence. Because we are ultimately one human community, world community. But how we draw distinctions is somewhat arbitrary and somewhat based on our historical and modern worldviews. Now, what would it take to have something like the EU? There's quite a few ingredients in this miracle, because it's quite a wonderful thing, the EU. It's something to appreciate. But those ingredients are quite unique to Europe, and we shouldn't expect those necessarily, for better and worse, in South Asia. The first is that there is long historical processes that led to the conception of Europe as one. In South Asia, that is not the case, because you never spoke locally of something like India. This was or even Hindustan. These were names assigned by foreigners. You would speak of Bengal because it was so big, or the Punjab because these things were so big, or Oudh, or Maharashtra, the Maratha Empire. These are so big, they are equivalent to countries in Europe, right? Even today, population of Pakistani Punjab is 100 million people, more than Germany. Uttar Pradesh is 200 million people. These are big enough to be separate units, right? And there was a lot of disintegration within Europe and then reintegration. And a lot of that experience was spent in misery. The book that I put there, my fiance recommended to me, Chłopki, because this is how her grandmother and women like that lived as peasants in Poland. It was very rough. And so they have to appreciate how much has been done thanks to the EU. The other thing is the trauma. I don't know how many, raise your hand if you listen to rock music, heavy metal stuff. Some people in the back modestly. There's this band from Germany called Rammstein, and this is from their music video, Deutschland. It's a very powerful song. And they, in Europe, they point out that this went through the Holocaust. Entire cities were destroyed, like Dresden or Warsaw, not to mention things like Auschwitz and Dachau, and God forbid. Have we experienced anything similar to that? We have not in living memory. The last time such trauma kind of happened was in 1947, something my Dada and Nana talk about, but it wasn't like this. Not like what they went through. They were literally at the point of annihilation. It's very different trauma that they went through. And I tell you this to give you a sense of appreciation of where you live in Pakistan. What is the major trauma that we have experienced since 1947? Nothing. We are so fortunate to be here. You may think I'd be better off any other place than here, but the truth is, if you have been living here, you have avoided a lot of the things. Now that's not true for all of South Asia. For example, in East Pakistan, there was something called Typhoon Bhola, which wiped out 30 lakh people. But in West Pakistan, they didn't feel that, right? So we here in this khitta, we've been very fortunate not to experience that trauma, to make them realize that this can't be done again. Europe has to work together for God's sake. Next time, with the new weapons, what they had deployed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it's going to be even worse. We better get this right. There was a deep consciousness among the survivors of this war in Europe, which we don't have. It was also an elite bargain. Previously, they did a lot of Dhindora Pitna about one another, and these are some propaganda posters of that time. We also do that Dhindora Pitna, but we don't do it to the same degree that they used to. So the first poster is how the Germans would describe the French, that it's this interracial, messed up army of crooks. The middle one is the British depiction of World War I Germany. He's a King Kong monster. And then the third one is Prometheus, that the French are coming to eat the noble body of Prometheus the German, right? So they have these concepts of so much rage that they had to suppress. No matter what the BJP tries to do, that hatred cannot mimic this. what was happening in Europe. And in Pakistan, the hatred towards India is actually not that strong among common people, which is a good thing. We shouldn't be hateful towards anybody. The other thing that is unique about the European experience after World War II's huge trauma is they had a split elite in the dominant country. There was the East Germany and West Germany, and they had different worldviews. One was gravitating towards Moscow, and the other was gravitating towards Washington. And so you actually had them not lumping together and saying, okay, time for revenge, in the same way that between the interwar period of World War I and II happened. It's quite a different thing that you actually dismantle that elite. And so West Germany was working very closely with France and the European steel community. Coal and steel, it's quite impressive to have this unique thing that you straitjacket the elite of the biggest country. But there are some questions now about even European integration we have to keep in mind. When you create something like that, suppose we did in South Asia, you would need to give a fair deal. What you're seeing there are protests in Athens, because Greece was given a terrible deal by the EU, and the Austrian banks basically pillaging Greece. It's a very serious thing. So not all countries in Europe have had the same experience of integration into Europe. And it isn't still in a fragile state. To maintain something as wonderful as the EU still has its enemies, the open society and its enemies kind of thing. You have Nigel Farage, who actually succeeded in getting Brexit done. You have Viktor Orban, who is basically the fifth column in the EU, according to many people, not in my opinion, but in many people's opinion. You have Marine Le Pen, a nationalist French lady who has really galvanized the French people, because France is very different today than when she was young. But even aside from these right-wing populists, you have very cogent arguments from the left-wing anarchist types like Yanis Varoufakis. He makes very cogent arguments for why this is a terrible thing. So if they have to maintain this integration of the EU, it is always in a fragile state. So even if we were to achieve it in South Asia, we have to be mindful of these larger things, and then maybe we might fall for a nice poster like that at the end. That's the ultimate goal. Thank you very much.